Hi, this is your host Bhartiya, and we are here at Open Infrastructure Summit in Denver, Colorado. And today we have with us Mark Shuttleworth. Mark, it's good to see you again.
You too, Swapnil.
And thanks for being on the show once again.
It's great.
It's kind of regular, yearly regular, where we sit down and talk about what's going on with Canonical and Ubuntu and a lot of other things. Because Canonical is its toes in a lot of different things, right? But we are at the Infrastructure Summit, so let's talk about infrastructure a bit.
Sure.
Let's start with Ubuntu. Because the project from where it started, it has come a long way now. Every company that I talk to, they happen to use Ubuntu, whatever they are doing. Even when they found the black hole picture, they were using, a lot of open source Ubuntu there.
It's kind of my dream job, right? We get to enable all of these incredible things that people do.
Exactly.
We can't get any credit for what they do, but it's still exciting to be kind of part of it, right?
Right.
So self-driving cars, black hole discoveries. I love the fact that we kind of, in a small way, are helping all of that happen.
Right. So if you look at the latest release of Ubuntu 1904, from infrastructure point of view, how you're making it easier for people like these scientists or other industries to because a lot of things that they are running, they are like workloads for you.
Yes.
So how do you help them so that it's easier for them so that they can focus on their workload,
Sure.
not at this layer?
So, there's an incredible amount of capability that's available in open source. The free software world really has kind of become the default for innovation and invention. And so, there's an amazing amount of possibility, but there's only a certain amount of time that people have, right? So you really want people to be able to spend their time on the stuff that is most important for them. So what we try to do is we try to take the possibilities that are out there in open source, figure out which ones are the things that are most useful to the most people, and then make those things really, really easy. Right? So either by putting them into the default platform, or by simplifying the process, or by working with the upstream effectively so that they can be in control of the publication process. There's lots of different things we can do. But at the end of the day, it's all about making sure that if you want to go and do something very difficult for the first time, that your piece is the piece that you have to focus on. Everything else is as easy as possible. So one of the things that we've realized is that you have technical friction, and we've been very good at getting rid of technical friction, right? To enable developers, technologists, inventors, to essentially use Ubuntu in lots of different ways. Now what we're sort of adding to that is a focus on commercial friction. So if you look at how large organizations consume Linux and open source, and you go and look at what's difficult for them to do in terms of their planning, in terms of their organization, in terms of their contracting, in terms of the support process, and so on, we realize that there's a lot of friction in all of that as well. And so if you want to make open source go faster, you have to make the business go faster, and you have to make the developers go faster. So that's why this week we essentially consolidated all support for all different kinds of open infrastructure, whether it's Kubernetes, whether it's Ceph, whether it's OpenStack, whether it's the kernel, whether it's KVM, whether it's Firecracker, whether it's Kata containers, all of those things we'll support under a single contract, which means that people can essentially mix and match all the different kinds of infrastructure capabilities that they want on public or private infrastructure under a single contract. So I think that's important too, right? Like, think about the developers and what makes the developers more productive, what makes the developers more efficient, what gives them access to the newest capabilities, but also think about the organizations, right? And how do they plan, how do they, manage their responsibilities effectively.
So how is let's talk about Ubuntu Advantage, program that you announced. How is it different from earlier? Was it that companies could buy different support for different components from Canonical?
That's right. They would get a contract for OpenStack, or they get a contract for Kubernetes, or they get a contract for bits and pieces of infrastructure. The way we've restructured all of that, essentially, it's just one contract. It's just a contract for infrastructure, and they have the freedom to change, like on any day, whether that infrastructure is going to be Kubernetes, whether it's going to be Ceph scale out, or whether it's going to be any number of things that we consider infrastructure effectively. In future, things like serverless will be infrastructure. Today, things like the logging, monitoring, and analytics stack, things like Prometheus, Grafana, Logstash, Graylog, Elasticsearch, those things we consider all of that infrastructure. That's just one contract. People can do as much of that as they like, effectively.
What if they are using more than one component versus they just want to use one component from the same contract?
It's one contract, so they can essentially do whatever they like across the whole estate.
Mm-hmm. And why did you do that? What are you reacting to?
It's interesting how complexity creeps into a system, right? You've got different groups inside an enterprise, like a large organization. They have different groups who want different things. And then at a place like Canonical, obviously you have different groups as well. And so all that happens is that you end up with these conversations between groups, and they each turn into a kind of a custom deal. But then as soon as these guys want to change their mind, they need to find another custom story. And so by just saying that, from Canonical's perspective, it's always one contract. No matter what you started using, you can use whatever you like, and you can get access to everybody always. It's just imposing a kind of a discipline on everybody to say that infrastructure is infrastructure, and we support open infrastructure. We support it openly, effectively, on the same price and terms. So if you're deploying OpenStack, it doesn't matter if you use Juju Charms, it doesn't matter if you used Ansible, it's the same support. If you're supporting Kubernetes, it doesn't matter if you used Kubatum or Charms or MicroStack, or if you're using GKE or AKS or EKS, that's essentially just one infrastructure deal.
What if somebody doesn't want to buy subscription, but they want to use your, product, that because Canonical, you're the one who championed, this is Ubuntu, you can use it for free, or you can run and...
So everything that was free is still free. We haven't changed that. What we've done commercially is to extend the lifespan. So now we support things for 10 years. And also, sometimes people want us to support things that aren't in the core supported set effectively, and then that would be a custom commercial relationship.
One of the beauties of Canonical was that anybody can use Ubuntu, for free. And also desktop was the, I don't know what should I call it, that made Canonical what it is today.
Linux for human beings.
Yeah. So I remember all those days, those wallpapers, and there was a lot of amazing community, Since I have come a long way as a journalist, so I don't focus, but it was a beautiful community. What is the place of desktop in your heart today?
So for me, desktop is very important. We have a big team on the desktop, and we also continue to work very well with multiple other desktops, right? So inside the Ubuntu community, obviously, we're focused on the GNOME desktop, but there's a very strong KDE community, especially Neon, for example, the guys who really focus on the latest and greatest in Neon. Then the Mate community, the lightweight Linux desktop communities. So as far as I'm concerned, the desktop is really, really important to the big mission of getting free software in the hands of as many people as possible, and also enabling developers, right? In the enterprise, we also see a big growth in Linux desktops for workstation purposes. So a lot of AI research and development is all on Ubuntu, and people want native Ubuntu effectively on very powerful workstations. And there are other areas where essentially institutions are building teams of developers, and we're supporting them for that. So the desktop is very close to my heart. We continue to invest in it. I think we also have to do a good job of supporting developers on Windows, supporting developers on Mac OS. But for those who kind of really want to immerse themselves in free software, we want to deliver the best desktop possible.
If you look at the trend in the desktop space, a lot of people say, desktop is dying, but I create work. I need a very powerful desktop actually. So for me, desktop will never die. And that is true for a lot of, we live in a world where people are creating VR content, Okay, you can consume it on the iPad, but where are you going to create it? You still need a powerful machine. And then, like Microsoft is doing excellent job with that, but they're also moving a lot of Windows you can run Windows in cloud now.
Right.
So I see a future where desktop will become even more critical.
Yeah.
And that might create an opportunity for Linux, because, those vendors can actually deep dive into the kernel level. And so do you still see a hope for desktop, Linux on desktop?
I do. I think that for the moment that audience is an engineering audience, right? And so it's an audience that I'm very passionate about, which is why we invest in it. We also do a lot of work with people like Dell, for example, to make sure that it works really well out of the box on their hardware. The slight difficulty there is that engineers also like to change things, and they also have opinions, and they don't want the same thing as everybody else, right? So it doesn't help too much if I push really hard to say this is the best desktop, because then people say, but it's not the best desktop for me, right?
Yeah.
So I learned that lesson from the Unity days. I thought we were doing really beautiful work, really good work, but people didn't like having that pushed on them. So now my thinking is let's support the GNOME environment, let's support the KDE environment, let's support the Mate environment. That gives developers freedom to choose all of those things, right? And it's also allowed us to kind of really grow our depth on the server, really grow our depth on the cloud, really grow our story for IoT. If you think about Snaps, the biggest users of Snaps today are desktop users. We kind of built Snaps for IoT, but it turns out that they've solved a big problem on the desktop because they make it much easier for publishers to push applications to the desktop effectively, right? So it's kind of interesting. I was focused on Snaps for IoT, but they've become this amazing thing on the desktop as well. And they're multi-desktop, right? The same Snap will work on KDE and work on other versions of Linux as well.
I mean, that is the story of Linux. Our people wanted to make it more resource efficient, and that helped Intel's, because data center now suddenly you can save billions and millions in bills. So it works for everybody. When I was talking to Linus, a few months ago, and he was like, one of the problems with the desktop is fragmentation. I don't want to create any controversy, but do you think, Linux on desktop might have succeeded? It was treated as one platform, so companies could just the way that they look at Mac, they have to just spin one DMG file for Windows exe file. Of course, you are doing something with Snap, but then we have Flatpak, we have app image. So once again, there is a fragmentation there. So I'm just asking a hypothetical, philosophical question that Linux might have succeeded if it was treated as just one platform. So companies were looking at Linux as one platform, not 20,000 distros.
I think that is possibly true, but the only way you would really achieve that is if you had made Linux so that legally only one person could make it, and then it wouldn't be Linux, right? I think the bigger challenge has been that we haven't invented anything in the Linux desktop that was like deeply, powerfully ahead of its time, right? I love what the Chrome OS guys do, right? Because essentially there was a very futuristic vision there of the desktop as an extension of the web, right? And so they deserve essentially their success because they were willing to go and create something that didn't exist. In a world where for most people the desktop looks like Windows, right? If in the free software community we only allow ourselves to talk about things that look like something that already exists, then we're sort of defining ourselves as a series of forks and fragmentations, right? This was something I found very difficult in Unity because I thought we did articulate a vision of convergence, and I believe it's going to happen. I think iOS and macOS will converge. We were 10 years ahead of that, right? But the community wouldn't let us do it, which is kind of crazy.
I know,
right? So.
I remember those days, because I held the prototype of Ubuntu phone, and I also got the demo of Ubuntu TV. I remember it was Mobile World Congress. Those were like exciting days, a lot of work was,
Now, to be clear, we failed, and we failed for lots of reasons. Many of them our own mistakes and so on. But I do think it's interesting that the desktop community became very angry at Unity, almost as if they just wanted something to be angry at. Right. I don't understand that behavior.
Even Linus has said, that there's an antagonistic approach, the community has, and that works against it sometimes. But I
think one of the great things about Linux and free software is that it's attracted people who want to be different and they want to change things. And that's great. That's an amazingly inventive crowd.
Right.
It makes it a little bit difficult to get what you're asking for, which is one thing that works for everybody, right? Because the very people who will come and be productive in a free software world are also people who will find fault with somebody else's thing, right? And so here we are.
Right. Let's quickly talk about the company now. Canonical is a privately owned company, but the thing is, we are in a phase where I call it Trinity, Red Hat, SUSE, and Canonical, So you are the only independent company left there. Actually, SUSE
is quite independent.
Inching towards becoming independent after equity, acquisition. So they are becoming independent. So how is the growth of the company? I know you cannot share a lot of numbers, but I just want to get some feel, and what is your long-term plan with the IPO you once talked about? So what do you have in your bag?
So sort of starting at the end, an IPO is still our plan of record. The management team is bought into that. The first step to that would be a growth equity round, which we'll do as soon as we're ready. In terms of growth, I think our enterprise growth is running at about 50% a year, which is great. It's a fairly big number and growing at that pace, which is nice. I feel like we've really figured out how to help organizations drive the whole data center efficiency story and also drive their public cloud story, right? We help organizations work efficiently on their chosen public clouds. We won't push them to this cloud or to that cloud, but whichever cloud they choose, we can help them effectively be very effective, very efficient as they move to the public cloud. Typically, as companies move to the public cloud, they also change a bunch of other things. They may, for example, replace their databases with open source databases or with SaaS databases from the cloud. They may replace messaging systems with open source messaging systems or messaging SaaS from the cloud effectively. All of those changes kind of go into the cloudification strategy or the digital strategy, and we've learned how to really help organizations with that on the public cloud. In the private infrastructure, it's really about automation. It's really about essentially saying, look, if you can get your own data center to have as few people involved in it as the public clouds do, well then your economics of your own data center start to be competitive with the public cloud. You should always have public cloud capacity, partnerships, relationships, supply chain effectively. Every business should have at least one public cloud that they buy from, probably two public clouds. But they should also look, if they have any sort of scale, they should also look to run a very efficient private infrastructure. And so we've learned how to essentially engage with companies for both of those things.
Excellent. I'll just use a few minutes to talk about your yesterday's keynote. There are two things that I am interested in. First of all, you mentioned foundations. So about a fig leaf. What I don't want you to name anybody, but what are you talking about? What problem do you see?
I won't name names.
Yeah.
I was trying to sort of get us thinking about leadership in open source, right? Open source is I think it's very valuable in the world. Socially and commercially and from an innovation point of view, et cetera. It's valuable in many, many ways. It's why I got lucky when I was very, very young, right? So I could choose what I wanted to do. And what I've essentially done is devote my professional life to figuring out open source in society at many levels, right? What I was calling out is that, I think we're seeing tensions between foundations and behaviors in foundations that are not really what we want, right? Now, I very much respect that the people who lead foundations have made a choice, like a personal choice, not to be in the commercial world, to be in the non-profit world. And I really believe we need non-profits in the open source world. I think there's a role for that, right? And I think it's still early. We haven't yet figured out, exactly what that is. But surely now we can look at some things and say, well, that's not what we want, right? So when we have open source foundations rage tweeting each other, we don't want that, right? Like, grow up, stop that, right? When we have foundations kind of claiming that they're better or more important than other foundations, we don't want that. When we have foundations acting like vendors, we don't want that either. When we have foundations kind of taking vendor stuff and pretending that it's not vendor stuff, like when it's really just a fig leaf, right? We don't want that either, right? Let the vendors be the vendors. They're perfectly good at it, right? Now, I'm not saying I have any answers for that, and I respect that the people who've, like I say, chosen to be in that world, that non-profit world, they play an important role, but we should hold them to account, and we should set a higher standard of expectation for them than we would proprietary software vendors, right? And people can hold me to a higher standard too, right? Like, I'm sure Twitter will call me a hypocrite because of this, and this, and I can take it. Like, I've got a thick skin.
But you are a vendor, So you. But
I am. Yeah.
But the foundation, they should not be behaving like vendors, as you have, said everything.
Or maybe they should. Look, you know what I mean? I think in an open-minded way, let's have a conversation about that. Like,
but it should be healthy conversation. It should not be about stealing the client kind of conversation.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I'm open to that. Maybe that's a good idea. Right. I think, for example, I love that Linus works for the Linux Foundation, right? It makes him completely independent. Right. I love that he can give the finger to anybody and everybody, right?
Without worrying about
it. And I don't think you should stop using his finger, because I think it's a potent, it's a potent signal to the community as to what's going to work and what's not going to work, right? So I think there's many good things that come out of having nonprofits in the mix. It's like figuring out democracy. It's like figuring out social capitalism. It's like figuring things out. It might take 100 years. All I was doing is saying, look, guys, there's some things here going on here that they don't work for us.
One last thing I would like to talk about is there's a trend. It's a small minority, but a lot of companies are getting worried. The public cloud companies, MongoDB did something, and what do you have? Because you have run your company on pure open source. You have been giving out your product for free to anybody. So what do you have? Are you worried about this trend?
I think there are two things that are important. First, a pure open source model doesn't work. And so sometimes I run into people and they say, well, the vendors should just be pure open source. And the simple fact is that it's too easy for them to be taken advantage of, and therefore there's no real incentive for them to do that, and therefore the innovation goes away, right? The second thing is that there has to be a kind of a bargain, right? Some sort of hard bargain between the people who use open source and the people who lead open source. I really believe in the value of maintainership and ownership, right? Like I like the idea that there's a company behind an open source project, because then you know that there's leadership of that, right? I don't like the idea when it's sort of like a nebulous community, because it doesn't work that way, right? Community's here today, gone tomorrow, people change their mind, they graduate from school, they do all sorts of things, right? I like to know that there's a company that cares about a piece of open source, and I'd like to understand how they're going to be successful, right? I think that's really, really important. There needs to be some bargain between that company and between the users of what they make. Now, Richard Stallman was very, very clever. He did a very good thing, right? He said, okay, if I make some open source, you get to use it, but the hard bargain is if you become a vendor build on it, then you must contribute back. That was the copyleft bargain, right? It was a very hard bargain, right? A tough, firm, clear bargain, right? Then we kind of went into a funny world of the Apache licensing world, where people thought that they could get money from investors to make something that there was no hard bargain, and then somehow magically it would work out. That didn't work so well, right? And now we're into the age of the cloud era, where again people are trying to find the balance. They're trying to find the bargain. I'm not trying to say I know what the answer is. I've been rambling now for about 5 minutes. But I do believe in these two clear ideas. First, there should be a tight organization behind a piece of open source typically, right? And you should know who that is, and you should figure out how to feed them. They need to be fed, right? It's not me, it's them that needs to be fed, right? It's Docker, or it's Mongo, or it's the people behind a piece of software. I like to know who they are, and I like to know that they're going to get fed. And then there needs to be some kind of fair bargain when other people are using that stuff that drives that stuff to get better. Either it's money flowing or it's code flowing, right? Those things I think are true. In a cloud world, I don't know what that bargain looks like. I don't know what those licenses look like. We'll figure it out, right?
So are you worried about it, that open source may lose again, or you are fully confident that we will figure something out?
I'm fully confident we'll figure something out. I think there'll be a bunch of name calling, and people will make mistakes, and all of those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, if you're just looking at, for example, the relationship between the cloud companies and the MongoDBs, they need each other, right? They really need each other, right? And so in the end, there'll be an incentive for them to figure it out.
Once again, Mark, thanks for talking to us today. And of course, we'll see you again, soon in some other event. Thank you.
See you again. Yeah.